The desert wind carried dust through the cracked window of Detective Maria Castellanos' office on the third floor of the Phoenix Police Department's cold case unit. It was August 2024, and the temperature outside had already climbed to 107 degrees by 9 in the morning. Maria sat motionless, staring at a photograph that had been pinned to her evidence board for 13 years. A young woman with honey blonde hair and green eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera lens, through time itself, asking a question that had never been answered. Abigail Walker, 23 years old when she vanished, 23 years old forever. The photograph showed her at a community center in Maryvale, wearing a volunteer's t-shirt and surrounded by children whose faces had been blurred for privacy. Her smile was genuine, the kind that reached her eyes and created small wrinkles at the corners. In her hands, she held a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are, her finger marking a place between pages as if she'd been interrupted mid-story. Someone had taken this picture 3 days before she disappeared. Maria's partner, Detective Robert Chen, entered carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, the cheap kind from the machine down the hall that tasted like burnt regret. "You're doing it again," he said, setting one cup on her desk, staring at her like she's going to speak. "She does speak," Maria replied, not taking her eyes from the photograph. "Every unsolved case speaks. We just have to learn the language." Robert had heard this before. He'd been working cold cases for 5 years, but Maria had been here for 19 years. The Walker case predated his arrival by 8 years, but he'd inherited it the way you inherit old furniture, something that comes with the space, heavy and immovable. The DNA results came back, Robert said, and the quality of silence in the room changed completely. Maria's hand, reaching for the coffee cup, stopped midway. Outside, a siren wailed past the building, heading towards some new crisis, some fresh wound in the city's skin. Inside this office, an old wound was about to be reopened, perhaps to finally heal, perhaps to hemorrhage worse than before. And? Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. Robert pulled a manila folder under his arm, the kind that had become almost ceremonial in their work. Thin paper barriers between the past and present, between questions and answers. He opened it carefully, though his hands shook slightly. After 5 years of working cold cases, he'd learned that answers were sometimes more devastating than mysteries. The blood sample from Abigail Walker's apartment, the one found behind the bookshelf in her bedroom. We got a hit in CODIS. Maria stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. The coffee cup tipped, spilling brown liquid across a stack of supplementary reports, but neither detective moved to clean it. "Who?" Maria asked. "Thomas Hendricks, 57 years old, high school teacher at Desert Vista High School. He's been teaching there for 32 years. Robert's voice was steady, professional, but his eyes told a different story. "Maria. He taught her, Abigail, when she was a junior, 11 years before she disappeared." The room seemed to tilt. Maria gripped the edge of her desk, feeling the familiar texture of the worn wood under her fingertips. The same desk where she'd eaten countless lunches, made hundreds of phone calls to Abigail's mother, written reports that went nowhere. The same desk where 7 years ago she'd almost closed the file permanently, almost consigned Abigail Walker to the ever-growing pile of cases that would never be solved. "Jesus Christ," Maria breathed. "He taught her." "There's more," Robert continued, his finger tracing lines in the report. "I pulled his employment records, every school where he's taught, going back to 1992 when he started, cross-referenced them with missing persons databases." He paused, looking up at Maria with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something between triumph and horror. 3 other women, 3 other young women, who went missing within a 50-mile radius of wherever he was teaching at the time. One in 1998 in Tempe, one in 2003 in Scottsdale, one in 2016 in Gilbert. Maria's mind raced through the implications, through the mathematics of evil. 4 women, possibly more, spanning decades. A man who stood in front of children every day, who taught them about metaphor and theme and the human condition, who assigned essays on morality and justice. That man had been stealing lives, erasing futures, creating absences that echoed through families and communities like soundless screams. "Where is he now?" Maria asked. "He's at the school.
It's summer session. He's teaching remedial English to students who need to make up credits. He checked his watch. Class ends at 10:30. I've got a tactical team standing by, and I've briefed Captain Morrison. We're going to take him quietly, no media circus. But Maria was already reaching for her jacket, already mentally preparing for the confrontation that would close a chapter that had been open for 13 years. She thought about Abigail's mother, Dorothy Walker, who still lived in the same small house in central Phoenix, who still kept Abigail's bedroom exactly as it had been in 2011, who still called Maria every year on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance to ask if there was any news.
Now there was news. Now there were answers. But answers, Maria had learned, were just new kinds of questions dressed in different clothes. "Let's go," she said. They drove in silence through Phoenix's grid of streets, past strip malls and apartment complexes, past murals celebrating the city's heritage and billboards advertising injury lawyers. The city had changed dramatically since 2011. New construction everywhere, old neighborhoods gentrified beyond recognition, tech companies moving in and driving up rents. But some things remained constant. The heat, the mountains on the horizon, and the people who disappeared into the spaces between what was known and what was suspected. Desert Vista High School sat on a sprawling campus in the eastern part of the city, surrounded by newly built housing developments with names like Sonoran Meadows and Cactus Springs, ironic titles for a landscape that was neither meadow nor spring, but desert trying to remember what it used to be. The main building was a modern structure of glass and steel, built to replace the older campus that had stood here when Abigail Walker was a student. Maria and Robert met the tactical team in the parking lot behind the gymnasium. 6 officers in plain clothes wearing bulletproof vests under loose shirts. The plan was simple. Wait for Thomas Hendricks to finish his class, approach him in the hallway, make the arrest cleanly. No need to traumatize the students, no need to create a scene that would play on loop on the evening news. But as they waited, Maria found herself thinking about Abigail Walker in a way she hadn't allowed herself to think in years. Not as a case file, not as a photograph on a board, but as a person who had been young once, who loved reading and working with children, who had dreams that were supposed to unfold across decades, but instead had been compressed into 23 years and then nothing. Abigail had been studying early childhood education at Phoenix College. She worked part-time at a daycare center and volunteered every Saturday at the Maryvale Community Center, reading to children whose families couldn't afford books. Her apartment had been filled with used paperbacks purchased from thrift stores, classics and contemporary fiction, poetry collections, and memoirs. According to her roommate's testimony, Abigail read every night before bed, sometimes for hours, losing herself in other worlds because, the roommate had said, Abby always felt like she was meant for something bigger than what she had. On September 17, 2011, Abigail left her apartment to meet a friend for coffee. She never arrived. Her car was found 3 days later in a parking garage downtown, keys in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat. Her phone was never recovered. Security cameras in the garage had been broken for weeks, something the building management had been meaning to fix. There were no witnesses, no leads, no evidence, except for a small amount of blood found during a second search of her apartment. Blood that had seeped into a crack behind a bookshelf and had been missed during the initial investigation. For 13 years, that blood sample had been the only physical evidence that something violent had happened to Abigail Walker. DNA technology in 2011 had been less sophisticated, and the sample had been too degraded to produce a useful profile. But technology improved. Techniques evolved, and 3 months ago, Maria had submitted the evidence for reanalysis using new extraction methods developed specifically for degraded samples. The bell rang inside the school, a digital chime that sounded nothing like the old mechanical bells Maria remembered from her own high school days. Students began pouring out of classrooms, a river of teenagers with backpacks and phones, laughing and complaining about the heat and making plans for later. They looked so young, Maria thought, so vulnerable. And Thomas Hendricks had been teaching students just like them for 3 decades. "There," Robert said quietly, nodding toward the east hallway. Thomas Hendricks emerged from a classroom carrying a battered leather briefcase and a stack of papers. He was tall, slightly stooped, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of an aging professor. He wore khaki pants and a blue button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked exactly what he was supposed to be, a dedicated teacher at the end of a long career, someone who had shaped young minds and fostered a love of literature in generations of students. Maria felt her stomach turn. This was always the hardest part, reconciling the monster with the man, understanding that evil rarely announced itself with horns and pitchforks, but instead wore ordinary faces and lived ordinary lives, hiding atrocities behind curtains of respectability. "Mr. Hendricks?" Maria called out, approaching with her badge already displayed. "I'm Detective Castellanos with the Phoenix Police Department. This is Detective Chen. We need you to come with us." Thomas Hendricks stopped walking. His expression didn't change. No surprise, no fear, no confusion. Just a strange, flat acceptance, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for 13 years and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. "Is this about Abigail?" he asked quietly. The hallway seemed to freeze. Students passing by slowed down, sensing something wrong, sensing that the normal order of their world was cracking. One of the tactical officers moved closer, hand near his weapon. "You need to come with us now, sir," Robert said firmly. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually," Thomas Hendricks said, and his voice was so calm, so measured, that it took a moment for the words to register. "DNA, right? That's how you caught me? I tried to be so careful, but there's always something, always one mistake."
Maria's hand moved to her handcuffs. "Thomas Hendricks, you're under arrest for the murder of Abigail Walker. You have the right to remain silent." "She was special, you know," he interrupted, and now there was emotion in his voice, something that might have been sadness or might have been nostalgia. "So bright, so full of potential. She reminded me of—" He stopped, seeming to catch himself. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Maria commanded, her voice harder now, professional armor snapping into place. As they cuffed him and led him toward the parking lot, students watched with phones raised, recording everything. By that evening, the footage would be everywhere: social media, news websites, the lead story on every local channel. Beloved teacher arrested in cold case murder. Desert Vista educator accused of killing former student. The man who taught them to read allegedly taught them to fear. But in that moment, Maria was thinking about none of those future headlines. She was thinking about Abigail Walker's green eyes in that photograph, about the way she held that children's book like it was something precious, about the stories she would never tell and the lives she would never touch. She was thinking about Dorothy Walker, waiting at home, not knowing that her phone was about to ring with the news she'd been dreading and hoping for simultaneously, that her daughter was really gone, that the man who'd taken her was finally caught, that the waiting was over, but the pain would never truly end. And she was thinking about the question that now bloomed in her mind like a dark flower. How many others? How many other Abigails were there scattered across the years like seeds thrown into the desert, waiting to be found? As they drove away from Desert Vista High School with Thomas Hendricks silent in the back seat, Maria looked at the mountains on the horizon, the same mountains that had watched over Phoenix for millennia, that had witnessed countless crimes and countless attempts at justice, that would continue watching long after all of them were gone. The case wasn't closed. It was cracking open, revealing depths that had been hidden for decades. And Maria knew, with the certainty that comes from years of experience, that they had only just begun to understand what Thomas Hendricks had done, and why, and how many lives he'd stolen in his quiet, methodical way. The news of Thomas Hendricks' arrest spread through Phoenix like wildfire through dry brush. By evening, Dorothy Walker's small house on Portland Street was surrounded by news vans, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky like flowers seeking sun. Maria Castellanos sat in Dorothy's living room, which hadn't changed in 13 years. Same floral sofa, same family photographs on the walls, same sense of suspended time that haunted the homes of those left behind. Dorothy was 71 now, her hair completely white, her hands trembling as she held the coffee cup Maria had made for her. She hadn't spoken for almost 10 minutes, just stared at the photograph of Abigail on the mantel, not the volunteer picture Maria knew so well, but a graduation photo from high school, Abigail in cap and gown, that brilliant smile suggesting futures that would never arrive. "Mr. Hendricks," Dorothy finally whispered. She loved his class. She used to come home and tell me about the books he assigned, the discussions they had. She wanted to be a teacher because of him. Maria felt the words like physical blows. This was always the cruelest part, discovering that the person who destroyed a life had once been someone that life admired, trusted, even loved. The betrayal wasn't just in the act of murder, but in the poisoning of every memory that came before. She wrote him a thank you card when she graduated, Dorothy continued, her voice gaining strength, but taking on a quality of disbelief. I found it years later when I was going through her things, looking for any clue. It said, "Thank you for teaching me that words have power, that stories can change the world." She kept a copy for herself. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. He taught her that words have power, and then he made sure she'd never speak again. "Mrs. Walker," Maria began, but Dorothy raised her hand. "I need you to tell me everything. Not the sanitized version, not the version that protects me from the horror. I've been living with not knowing for 13 years. Now I need to know." So Maria told her. About the DNA match, about the 3 other missing women, about how Thomas Hendricks had shown no surprise when arrested, had almost seemed relieved. She told Dorothy about the search warrant they had executed on his home that afternoon, and what they'd found in his basement, a locked filing cabinet containing newspaper clippings about all 4 women, photographs, personal items that had never been reported missing because their significance had seemed too small. Abigail's copy of The Great Gatsby, the one she'd been assigned in Hendricks's class with his notes in the margins. A bracelet she'd worn as a teenager, silver with a small infinity charm. The thank you card Dorothy had just mentioned, kept like a trophy. "He's confessing," Maria said quietly. "Started talking the moment we put him in the interrogation room. Says he wants to tell us everything, wants us to know the full story, as he calls it. We're recording every word." Dorothy's coffee cup clattered against the saucer. "Why? Why did he do it? Why my Abby?" "We don't have all the answers yet," Maria admitted. "But from what he's saying," she paused, unsure how much detail to provide, then decided Dorothy deserved the truth. He developed an obsession with her when she was a student. Not romantic, he says, but paternal. He claimed she reminded him of his daughter, who died in a car accident in 1989. Same age, same look, same love of reading. "So he killed her?" Dorothy's voice rose. "Because she reminded him of his daughter?" "It's more complicated than that. After she graduated, he started following her. showing up at places he knew she'd be, the community center where she volunteered, the coffee shop where she studied. He convinced himself he was watching over her, protecting her. Then, in September 2011, he saw her with a man, someone she was dating casually. He said it broke the spell. He realized she was never going to be what he wanted her to be. Dorothy stood abruptly, walking to the window where reporters still clustered on the sidewalk. "My daughter died because some man couldn't handle his grief? Because she wasn't a replacement for someone else?" "I'm so sorry," Maria said, knowing the words were inadequate, knowing that no words could bridge the chasm between Dorothy's loss and the world's indifference. "Tell me about the others," Dorothy demanded, turning back. "The other women, who were they?" Maria pulled out her phone, showing Dorothy the photographs of 3 other young women, all blonde, all with similar features to Abigail. Jennifer Martinez disappeared in 1998, age 22. Rebecca Lawson disappeared in 2003, age 24. And Sarah Chen disappeared in 2016, age 23. All former students of his. All lived within driving distance of where he was teaching. Dorothy studied each face, her expression hardening. "Have you told their families?" "We're in the process. Rebecca's parents still live in Scottsdale. Sarah's mother is in Gilbert. Jennifer's family moved to California, but we've made contact." "I want to meet them," Dorothy said firmly. "The other mothers, we need to meet." "Mrs. Walker?" "Don't." Dorothy's voice was steel now. "Don't tell me it's not a good idea or that I need time to process. I've had 13 years to process. Those women, those families, they're the only people in the world who understand what this feels like. We need each other." Maria nodded slowly. She'd seen this before. The way tragedy created unexpected communities. The way grief found its tribe. "I'll arrange it," she promised. After Maria left, Dorothy Walker sat alone in her living room as darkness fell outside. She thought about Abigail not as the frozen image in photographs, but as the living, breathing daughter she had raised, the little girl who'd cried when she accidentally stepped on a caterpillar, the teenager who'd stayed up all night to finish Jane Eyre because she couldn't bear to put it down, and the young woman who'd called her mother every Sunday evening to share stories about the children she worked with. Abigail had been 3 weeks old when Dorothy's husband left, unable to handle the responsibilities of fatherhood. Dorothy had raised her daughter alone, working double shifts as a nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital, taking night classes to get her degree, building a life from the wreckage of abandonment. And Abigail had thrived, not despite the hardship, but perhaps because of it, learning early that strength wasn't about avoiding difficulty, but about facing it with grace. "You got your strength from her," people would tell Abigail. "You're just like your mom." But Abigail would shake her head and smile. "I got my strength from books," she'd say. "From seeing how characters survive impossible things. That's why I want to teach, so kids know they can survive too." Dorothy walked to Abigail's bedroom, the shrine she'd maintained for 13 years. Everything was exactly as Abigail had left it. The poster of Virginia Woolf on the wall, the stack of lesson plans she'd been developing for her future classroom, the journal she had kept since high school. She'd read that journal countless times, searching for clues, but now she picked it up and opened it to a random page, dated March 2007, Abigail's junior year when she'd been in Thomas Hendricks' class. "Mr. Hendricks stayed after school today to help me with my essay on symbolism in the Scarlet Letter. He said that I have a gift for seeing the deeper meanings in literature, that I think like a real scholar. He told me about his daughter who would have been my age if she'd lived. I felt sad for him. He seems lonely. I'm glad I can make him smile by doing well in his class." Dorothy's hands shook. Even then, even as a 16-year-old, Abigail had been generous with her empathy, had wanted to ease someone else's pain. And Thomas Hendricks had taken that empathy, that kindness,
and had twisted it into something monstrous. She turned more pages, reading entries from Abigail's senior year, her first years of college, her growing excitement about becoming a teacher. The last entry was dated September 16, 2011, one day before she disappeared. Met the most amazing little girl at the community center today. Her name is Maya, and she's 6, and she told me she wants to be a writer when she grows up. I gave her my copy of Where the Wild Things Are, the one Mom gave me when I was her age. She hugged me and said I was her favorite teacher, even though I'm not officially a teacher yet. This is why I do this. This is why it all matters. To be someone's favorite teacher, to be the person who shows them that words can be magic, there's no greater gift. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Dorothy closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, tears streaming down her face. Abigail had been exactly where she was supposed to be, on the cusp of a meaningful life, about to pour her gifts into the world. And Thomas Hendricks had stolen all of it, had erased every future moment, every child she would have taught, every life she would have touched. The phone rang. Dorothy almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter, but something made her pick up.
Mrs. Walker? An unfamiliar female voice, hesitant and thick with emotion. My name is Patricia Martinez. My daughter Jennifer disappeared in 1998. Detective Castellanos gave me your number. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. Dorothy gripped the phone tighter. It's okay. It's more than okay. I needed to talk to someone who understands, who knows what this feels like. The news said they caught him, that he confessed, but instead of feeling relief, I just feel... Her voice broke. I feel angry. So angry. I know, Dorothy said. And she did know. She understood with perfect clarity. I'm angry too. They talked for 2 hours, comparing memories, sharing photographs through text messages, discovering the terrible similarities in their daughter's stories. Jennifer had also been a former student of Hendricks, had also been kind and empathetic, had also planned to become a teacher. She'd been home from college for the summer when she disappeared after a shift at the bookstore where she worked. They never found her, Patricia said. 26 years, and I never knew what happened. Part of me hoped she was alive somewhere, that she'd run away and started a new life. But I knew, deep down, I knew she was gone. And now I have confirmation, but not closure. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Dorothy replied. I don't think closure exists. I think we just learn to carry the weight differently. By the time they said goodbye, both women felt something neither had expected, a sense of connection, of shared understanding that transcended the particular details of their grief. This was what tragedy did, Dorothy thought. It either isolated you completely or created bonds stronger than any formed through joy. The next morning, Dorothy drove to the community center in Maryvale where Abigail had volunteered. It had changed names twice since 2011, had undergone renovations, but the basic structure remained the same. The director, a woman named Rosa Hernandez, had worked there for 20 years and remembered Abigail clearly. She was magic with the kids, Rosa said as they walked through the building. Every Saturday she'd read for 2 hours straight, doing all the voices, making them laugh. Children who normally couldn't sit still would be completely absorbed when Abby read. They stopped in front of a small reading room with child-sized furniture and shelves full of books. On the wall was a plaque Dorothy had never seen before. The Abigail Walker Reading Room, established 2012, in memory of a young woman who believed every child deserves a story. We fundraised for it, Rosa explained, after she disappeared. The community wanted to honor her, wanted to make sure her name wouldn't be forgotten. She smiled sadly. There's a girl who comes here now, maybe 12 or 13. Her name is Maya. She says Abby was her first real teacher, even though Abby wasn't formally a teacher. Maya writes stories now. She says she wants to be a writer because of Abby.
Dorothy felt tears rising again, but this time they weren't entirely born of grief. There was something else mixed in, a sense of continuation, of legacy. Abigail's dream of teaching, of touching lives through stories, had not died with her. It had scattered like seeds, taking root in unexpected places. "Can I meet her?" Dorothy asked. "This girl, Maya?" "She comes on Saturdays. She volunteers now, reading to the little kids, just like Abby did." Dorothy nodded. Saturday. She could wait until Saturday. She'd waited 13 years. She could wait 4 more days. As she drove home through Phoenix's late morning heat, Dorothy thought about what justice meant. Thomas Hendricks would be prosecuted, would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. The legal system would unfold in its slow, methodical way, and eventually there would be a verdict, a sentence, a conclusion to the legal narrative. But that wasn't really justice, Dorothy understood. Justice wasn't punishment, it was restoration. And nothing could restore what had been taken. True justice, if it existed at all, would be found in the small moments, in Maya writing her stories, in other children discovering that words could be magic, in the continuation of the work Abigail had loved. That was the only victory possible in a world that allowed people like Thomas Hendricks to exist, to make sure that what they tried to destroy kept living anyway, in different forms, through different hands. When she got home, there was an envelope in her mailbox, hand-addressed with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with child's handwriting. "Dear Mrs. Walker, my name is Maya, and I heard what happened. I'm sorry about Miss Abby. She was the best teacher I ever had. I still have the book she gave me. I read it to the little kids now. I'm reading it for her. I hope that's okay. Love, Maya." Dorothy sat on her front steps, reading the note over and over, and for the first time since Maria Castellanos had appeared at her door with news of the arrest, she felt something other than rage and grief. She felt purpose. Abigail's story wasn't over. It was just beginning in new ways, through new voices, in the hearts of children who'd been touched by her brief time on Earth. And Dorothy would make sure that story continued, that her daughter's name became synonymous not with tragedy, but with the power of kindness, the importance of reading, the sacred responsibility of teaching. She would meet the other mothers whose daughters Thomas Hendricks had stolen. They would form their own community, their own network of support and advocacy. They would push for changes in how schools screened teachers, how warning signs were identified, how past victims were connected to present investigations. They would turn their grief into action, their loss into legacy.
Because that was what Abigail would have done. That was what Abigail had been teaching all along, that the most powerful response to darkness wasn't resignation, but resistance, wasn't acceptance, but transformation. Dorothy Walker stood up, folded Maya's note carefully, and went inside to begin making phone calls. There was work to be done, and she had wasted enough time waiting for answers. Now it was time to create them. The interrogation room at Phoenix Police Department headquarters was designed to be deliberately uncomfortable. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in a sickly pallor, a metal table bolted to the floor. Thomas Hendricks sat with his hands folded, a position of false prayer, and spoke in the measured tones of a man giving a lecture. Detective Maria Castellanos and Detective Robert Chen sat across from him, recording every word. Maria had been in thousands of interrogations over her career, but this one disturbed her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. There was no remorse in Hendricks's voice, no horror at what he'd done, just a strange clinical detachment, as if he were discussing characters in a novel, rather than real women whose lives he'd ended. "Abigail reminded me of Catherine," Hendricks said, referring to his deceased daughter. Not just physically, though there was that. It was the way she approached learning, the way she lit up when discussing literature. Catherine had been the same way. When she died, drunk driver, she was 17. I thought I'd never feel that spark of connection again.
So you stalked Abigail Walker, Maria stated flatly. I prefer to think of it as keeping watch, Hendricks corrected, and the arrogance in his tone made Maria's jaw clench. I wanted to make sure she fulfilled her potential, that she didn't waste her gifts. By killing her? Robert interjected, his voice sharp. He sighed, as if disappointed by their inability to understand. I didn't plan to kill any of them. That was never the intention. I wanted... He paused, searching for words. I wanted to preserve them, to keep them at the moment of their perfect potential, before life could corrupt them, before they could become ordinary. Preserve them? Maria repeated, feeling sick. You murdered 4 women because you wanted to preserve them? You make it sound monstrous. Hendricks looked genuinely confused. But think about it from a literary perspective. Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, the lovers frozen forever in their moment of anticipation. Forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. That's what I gave them. Immortality through absence. Though ever age, never disappoint, never lose their magic. Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need a break, he said, and left the room before Maria could respond. Alone with Hendricks, Maria leaned forward. Tell me exactly what happened on September 17th, 2011. Every detail. Hendricks seemed almost eager to comply, as if he'd been waiting years for someone to ask. I'd been following Abigail for about 3 months. Not every day, I had my teaching responsibilities, but often enough to know her patterns, where she went, whom she saw. I told myself I was protecting her, making sure she stayed safe in a dangerous world. But you were the danger, Maria said. I didn't see it that way then. For the first time, something like uncertainty crossed Hendricks's face. I genuinely believed I cared about her well-being. Then I saw her with that man, some business student from ASU. They were at a restaurant downtown, and he was so ordinary, so unworthy of her. She was laughing at his jokes, touching his hand across the table, and I realized she was going to throw away her potential on someone common. So you decided to kill her. I decided to talk to her, Hendricks corrected, to remind her who she really was, what she was meant to become. I waited outside her apartment that night. When she came home, I approached her in the parking lot. I told her I'd been worried about her, that I'd seen her making questionable choices. I said she reminded me of my daughter, and I couldn't bear to see her waste her gifts. What did she say? Hendricks's expression darkened. She was kind at first, thanked me for my concern, but said she was happy, that her life was her own to live. Then she asked... He stopped, and for the first time, genuine emotion entered his voice. She asked if I needed help, if I'd been seeing a therapist to deal with my daughter's death. She was concerned about me. Can you imagine? I was trying to save her, and she was trying to save me. And that made you angry, Maria guessed. It made me realize she'd never understand, that she was already too corrupted by modern ideas of independence and self-actualization. She'd never be what I needed her to be. So when she turned to go inside, when she dismissed me like I was some random stranger instead of someone who cared deeply about her future, he trailed off. What did you do? Maria pressed. I grabbed her arm. She tried to pull away. We struggled. She dropped her phone and it shattered on the concrete. I got her into her apartment. I don't remember how exactly. The adrenaline, you know? Inside, she was crying, asking why I was doing this. I tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. She said she was going to call the police, and I knew if she did, everything would be over. My career, my life, my mission to protect young women from wasting their potential. Maria's hands were fists under the table. So you killed her. There was a bookshelf in her bedroom. She'd been reorganizing it, and some of the shelves were loose. When she tried to run past me, I pushed her. She fell against the bookshelf, and it toppled. The corner of one of the shelves caught her temple. Calm, recounting the violence, as if describing a scene from a play. There was so much blood.
I tried to stop it, but she stopped moving, stopped breathing, and I realized this was the preservation I'd been seeking. She would never disappoint now, never become ordinary. "What did you do with her body?" Maria asked, though she already knew this would be the hardest part for the families to hear. "I put her in her car and drove to a place I knew in the desert, past Cave Creek. There's a mine shaft there, old and abandoned. I'd found it years ago while hiking. No one ever goes there." He met Maria's eyes. "She deserved better, I know that now, but in that moment I thought I was giving her a kind of immortality." Maria stood, her legs shaking. "We're done for today." "Wait," Hendricks said. "Don't you want to know about the others? Jennifer, Rebecca, Sarah? I can tell you everything. I want to tell you everything." "Tomorrow," Maria managed, and left the room. She found Robert in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. "I've been doing this for 5 years," he said, without opening his eyes. "I've never heard anything like that. The way he talks about murdering them, like it was an act of love." "He's a narcissist," Maria said, her voice mechanical. "Everything he does is rationalized through his own warped lens. Those women weren't people to him. They were symbols, placeholders for his dead daughter, objects to possess." "We need to find the bodies," Robert said, finally opening his eyes. "We need to bring them home." Maria nodded. "I'll organize search teams for the desert location he mentioned, and we need to get him to tell us where the other 3 are." But as they stood in that hallway, both detectives felt the weight of what was coming, not just the searches and the legal proceedings, but the conversations with families, the news conferences, the public's reaction. Thomas Hendricks had been teaching for 32 years. How many students had sat in his classroom, admired him, learned from him? How many parents had trusted him with their children's education? The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systemic, institutional. It would shake the community's faith in the very structures designed to protect and nurture young people. The news broke fully the next morning. Not just the arrest, but the confession, the details about multiple victims. Phoenix woke up to headlines that felt apocalyptic. Teacher's 32-year reign of terror. Desert Vista educator confesses to serial murders. How many more victims? The school district went into crisis mode. Superintendent Dr. Patricia Reeves held a press conference at 9 a.m., standing at a podium with the district's lawyer beside her, fielding questions from dozens of reporters. "When did you first become aware of concerning behavior from Mr. Hendricks?" one reporter shouted. "We had no complaints on file, no disciplinary actions, no warning signs. His evaluations were consistently excellent. Parents requested him specifically for their children." "But there must have been something," another reporter pressed. 4 women dead over 26 years and no one noticed anything? Dr. Reeves' composure cracked slightly. "We are cooperating fully with the police investigation. We're also conducting our own internal review of all personnel files, all protocols. If there were failures in our system, we will identify them and address them." But it was too late for protocols to save anyone. The damage was done, layered across decades. At Desert Vista High School, students who'd been in Hendricks's classes were being interviewed by investigators. The school library had been converted into a temporary command center, with detectives talking to teenagers one at a time, asking if they'd ever felt uncomfortable, if Hendricks had ever said or done anything inappropriate. Melissa Torres, a senior who'd taken Hendricks's AP literature class the previous year, sat across from a female detective, her hands trembling. "He was always nice to me. Nice enough, maybe. Like, he'd compliment my essays a lot, say I reminded him of students he'd had years ago who'd gone on to do great things. Once he asked if I'd ever thought about teaching. When I said maybe, he told me I'd be perfect for it.
that I had the kind of empathy and insight that made great teachers. "Did he ever contact you outside of school?" the detective asked. Melissa hesitated. "He friend requested me on Facebook last year. I didn't accept it. It felt weird, but he wasn't pushy about it. And once I saw him at the coffee shop where I study sometimes. He sat down and talked to me for like 20 minutes about college applications. It seemed helpful at the time, but now it feels different." Similar stories emerged from other students. Small interactions that had seemed benign or even kind in the moment, but now took on sinister dimensions. Hendricks had been careful, never crossing obvious lines, never doing anything that would trigger immediate alarm. He'd been patient, methodical, building trust over years before making any move. But some teachers had noticed things. Margaret Sullivan, who'd taught history at Desert Vista for 15 years, came forward with information she'd never reported. "About 6 years ago, I was working late grading papers. I saw Thomas in the parking lot, sitting in his car. It was almost 8 p.m., and I thought maybe he'd fallen asleep.
Or his car wouldn't start. I went over to check on him and he seemed startled. He said he was just sitting, thinking about lesson plans. But when I looked closer, I saw he had a yearbook open in his lap, and he was looking at pictures of former students, all young women. I asked if everything was okay, and he closed the book quickly, said he was reminiscing about successful students. It felt off, but I didn't know what to do with that feeling."
"Why didn't you report it?" the investigator asked. Margaret's face crumpled. "Because I didn't have proof of anything wrong. He wasn't breaking any rules by looking at an old yearbook, and Thomas was respected, well-liked. I thought maybe I was reading too much into it, projecting my own weird feelings onto an innocent situation. I didn't want to ruin someone's career over nothing." This became the refrain Maria heard repeatedly as she interviewed Hendricks' colleagues, people who'd sensed something wrong but hadn't trusted their instincts, who dismissed their concerns as paranoia, who'd prioritized politeness and professional courtesy over uncomfortable confrontations. The cultural dynamics that had allowed Hendricks to operate for decades were becoming painfully clear. He'd been a white man in a position of authority, well-educated and articulate, who'd learned exactly how much he could push boundaries without triggering institutional responses. He'd been skilled at reading power structures, at identifying which students were vulnerable, those without strong family support, those eager for mentorship, those who reminded him of his daughter. 3 days after the arrest, Maria organized a search of the desert location Hendricks had described. It was brutally hot, 115 degrees by noon, and the terrain was treacherous, full of hidden drops and unstable ground. 20 officers and volunteers with cadaver dogs spread across several square miles, looking for the abandoned mine shaft. Dorothy Walker had insisted on coming, despite Maria's protests. She stood at the edge of the search perimeter, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, watching the team's work. Patricia Martinez, Jennifer's mother, had driven up from Tucson, where she'd moved years ago. They stood together, these two women bound by grief, not speaking, but present. It took 4 hours before one of the dogs alerted near a cluster of Palo Verde trees. The mine shaft was partially concealed by decades of desert growth, its opening barely 3 feet wide. Maria approached carefully, shining a flashlight into the darkness. "We need the forensics team and rope equipment. It's deep." The recovery took 2 days. The heat made working in short shifts necessary, and the depth of the shaft, nearly 60 feet, complicated everything. But eventually they brought up remains, not one body, but multiple sets of bones, weathered by time and the harsh conditions, but still yielding evidence. Abigail Walker, Jennifer Martinez, Rebecca Lawson, all in the same pit, discarded like broken dolls. Maria was the one who had to tell Dorothy. They sat in Maria's car, air conditioning blasting, while outside the desert shimmered with heat. "We found her. We're bringing her home." Dorothy didn't cry. She'd moved beyond tears into some deeper realm of grief. "Can I see her?" "Not yet.
The forensics team needs time, but soon, I promise. And the others? Jennifer and Rebecca, yes. We're still looking for a Sarah Chen. He says he buried her separately somewhere in the Superstition Mountains. We'll find her. Dorothy nodded slowly. He threw them away. After all that talk about preserving them, about keeping them perfect, he threw them in a hole in the ground and forgot about them. He didn't forget, Maria said, and she pulled out photographs from the evidence recovered from Hendricks's home. He visited. We found a logbook in his basement. He'd been going to that mine shaft 2 or 3 times a year for over a decade. He'd sit there and read poetry aloud, Keats, Wordsworth, Dickinson. He documented every visit, every poem he read. He thought he was... Maria's voice broke. He thought he was honoring them. Dorothy took the logbook, flipping through pages of Hendricks's neat handwriting. Each entry was dated, noted the weather conditions, listed the poems read. Some entries included longer reflections. I read Annabel Lee today, thought of Abigail and how she loved Poe. The desert is a fitting tomb for angels. Another. Jennifer would have been 40 today. She remains forever 22. This is the gift I gave them all. Dorothy closed the logbook. He's insane, she said flatly. No, Maria replied. That would almost be easier. He's been evaluated by 3 psychiatrists. They all agree he's not psychotic, not delusional in the clinical sense. He knows right from wrong. He just doesn't care. He's constructed an elaborate justification for his actions, but underneath it all, he knows exactly what he did. Dorothy closed the logbook. I want to speak at his trial. I want him to hear what he took from me, from all of us. You will have that opportunity, Maria assured her. But the trial was months away. First came the process of formal identification, of death certificates being issued after 13 years of absence, of funeral arrangements that should have been made in 2011. The Phoenix community reacted to the revelations with a mixture of horror, anger, and introspection. Desert Vista High School became a gathering place for former students, many of whom shared their own uncomfortable experiences with Hendricks.
Now adults with children of their own, who'd been taught by Hendricks and now had to reconcile their positive memories with the monstrous truth. A candlelight vigil was organized in the school's parking lot. Hundreds of people came, holding candles and photographs, not just of the 4 confirmed victims, but of every missing woman from the Phoenix area over the past 3 decades. The unspoken question hung in the air. Were there more? How many more? Sarah Chen's mother, Linda, stood at the microphone, her voice amplified across the crowd. My daughter disappeared in 2016. She was 23 years old, brilliant, planning to go to medical school. The police told me they had no leads, no evidence, nothing to suggest foul play. They said she probably ran away, started a new life. But a mother knows. I knew something terrible had happened, and now I know what. Now I know who. She paused, tears streaming down her face. But I still don't have her body. I still can't lay her to rest. That man, that monster who taught my daughter freshman English, who she trusted and admired, he won't tell us exactly where she is. He says he can't quite remember which part of the Superstition Mountains, as if my daughter's burial site is some trivial detail he's misplaced. The crowd murmured, angry and sympathetic. Maria stood at the edge, watching, knowing that Linda's frustration would only grow. Hendricks was playing games now, rationing information, enjoying the power of being the only person who knew certain truths. He told them about Abigail, Jennifer, and Rebecca readily enough, but Sarah's location he was withholding, using it as leverage for better prison accommodations, for attention, for the twisted satisfaction of keeping control. Detective Chen was working that angle, negotiating with Hendricks through his lawyer. Tell us where Sarah Chen is, and we'll recommend you serve your time in a facility with better library access, he'd offered. Hendricks laughed. You think I care about libraries? I've read everything worth reading. What I want is for people to understand.
I want to write a book about my experiences, about the philosophy behind my actions. I want an audience. You want infamy, Robert had countered. I want understanding, Hendricks insisted. These women, they were special. I saw something in them that the world would have crushed. I preserved that specialness. That deserves to be documented, studied, understood. The narcissism was breathtaking. Even as he sat in a jail cell facing 4 counts of first-degree murder, Thomas Hendricks was convinced he'd done something noble, something that would be appreciated if only people could see it from his perspective. Maria had dealt with many killers in her career, but Hendricks disturbed her in a unique way. He was educated, articulate, superficially sympathetic. He could discuss literature and philosophy, could quote poetry and make cultural references that made him seem cultured and thoughtful. But underneath that veneer was a vast emptiness, an inability to see other people as fully human. To him, Abigail, Jennifer, Rebecca, and Sarah had been characters in his personal narrative, symbols to be manipulated, rather than people with their own interior lives, their own dreams and fears and desires. The school district's internal investigation revealed what many had suspected. There had been warning signs, but they'd been dismissed or ignored. A student in 2004 had complained that Hendricks made her uncomfortable, that he'd asked too many personal questions about her family and dating life. The complaint had been filed, Hendricks had been talked to by administrators, and he'd apologized and promised to maintain better professional boundaries. The student had graduated and moved away, and the complaint had been archived and forgotten. A parent in 2009 had expressed concern that Hendricks had shown up at her workplace, a bookstore, and engaged in a lengthy conversation that the daughter found awkward. When confronted, Hendricks had explained he was simply encouraging a former student to pursue her interests in literature. The parent hadn't pushed further. There were other incidents, all minor individually, but forming a pattern when viewed collectively. The problem was that no one had viewed them collectively. Each complaint had been handled in isolation, filed away, never cross-referenced with others. The systems that should have protected students had failed. Not through malice, but through fragmentation, through a lack of coordination and follow-through. Dr. Reeves announced sweeping changes: mandatory reporting systems, centralized tracking of all complaints, regular training for recognizing grooming behavior, partnerships with law enforcement. But these changes couldn't help Abigail, Jennifer, Rebecca, or Sarah. They were promises to future potential victims, preventative measures that came too late for those already gone. Dorothy Walker watched the news about the policy changes with mixed emotions. She was glad something was being done, but she also felt the bitter irony. Her daughter's death was being used to prevent future deaths, as if that somehow balanced the cosmic scales. It didn't. Abigail was still gone, still buried in the desert for 13 years, while Thomas Hendricks had continued teaching, continued grooming other potential victims, continued living his comfortable life. 5 weeks after the arrest, Dorothy attended the first meeting of what they decided to call the Phoenix Coalition, the families of Hendricks victims, along with victims' rights advocates and criminal justice reform experts. They met in a community room at the library. 10 people gathered around tables pushed together, united by tragedy and determination. Patricia Martinez was there, having taken a leave of absence from her job to focus on advocacy. Linda Chen came from Gilbert. Rebecca Lawson's father, Michael, had flown in from Colorado, where he'd moved after his daughter's disappearance. And there were others, family members of women who'd gone missing under suspicious circumstances in areas where Hendricks had taught. Cases that hadn't been definitively linked to him, but showed similar patterns.
We need to push for longer sentences for stalking, one advocate suggested. Most stalking laws are misdemeanors unless violence occurs. By then it's too late. We need better background check systems, another added. Ways to track teachers who move between districts after complaints. Dorothy listened to the proposals, the action items, the strategic plans. They were all good ideas. All necessary reforms, but they felt insufficient against the magnitude of what had been lost. 4 lives ended, dozens more damaged, former students who now had to reconcile their memories, families torn apart, a community's trust shattered. "I want to focus on something else, too," Dorothy said when there was a pause in the conversation. "I want to make sure these women aren't remembered only as victims. They were daughters, friends, dreamers. They had personalities, quirks, favorite books and movies. I don't want them reduced to statistics in a crime story." Patricia nodded vigorously. Jennifer loved photography. She was always taking pictures, carrying her camera everywhere. "I have thousands of her photos stored in boxes. I want people to see her work, to know she was an artist." Rebecca volunteered in an animal shelter. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She'd bring home strays constantly, nurse injured birds back to health. "Sarah was going to change the world," Linda said quietly. "She wanted to be a doctor, specialize in pediatric oncology. She'd lost a younger brother to leukemia and was determined to save other children." They spent the next hour sharing memories, showing photographs, telling stories that had nothing to do with how these women died and everything to do with how they'd lived. And in that sharing, something shifted. They weren't just a collection of grieving relatives. They were witnesses to lives that had mattered, testifiers to the value of what had been stolen. By the end of the meeting, they'd created a plan, a memorial website featuring each woman's story, not as a victim, but as a whole person. A scholarship fund for students pursuing teaching, veterinary medicine, and medicine, the careers Abigail, Rebecca, and Sarah had been working toward. And a push for legislation that would require better coordination between school districts when teachers moved, creating a database that would track complaints and concerning behavior patterns. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something, and something was better than surrendering to the crushing weight of nothing. As Dorothy drove home that night, she thought about what justice really meant. Not just punishment for Hendricks, though that was necessary. Real justice would be making sure these women's names outlasted his, that their dreams and accomplishments were remembered long after people forgot the details of his crimes. Abigail Walker would not be a footnote in Thomas Hendricks' story. Thomas Hendricks would be a footnote in Abigail Walker's legacy. That, Dorothy decided, was the only victory available in this wilderness of loss, and she would fight for it with everything she had left. 3 months after Thomas Hendricks' arrest, the full scope of his crimes was still unfolding like a terrible map, each new revelation adding another layer of horror to what was already almost incomprehensible. Detective Maria Castellanos stood in front of a wall-sized evidence board in the cold case unit, marking connections with red string, a cliché from crime dramas, but sometimes clichés existed because they worked. The board now showed not 4 victims, but 7 possible victims. 3 additional women had disappeared from areas where Hendricks had taught or visited regularly. Amanda Price in 1995 before Jennifer Martinez, Colleen O'Brien in 2007 between Rebecca and Abigail, and Taylor Washington in 2019 after Sarah Chen. The evidence wasn't conclusive yet. No DNA matches, no confession, but the patterns were unmistakable. Robert Chen entered with coffee and a thick folder. "Got the forensic anthropology report on the remains from the mine shaft," he said, handing her the folder. "It's worse than we thought." Maria opened it, scanning the technical language until she found the summary. "Oh, God," she breathed. "There were 5 bodies in that shaft," Robert said grimly. "Not 3. We've tentatively identified the other 2 as Amanda Price and Colleen O'Brien based on dental records and jewelry found with the remains." Maria sank into her chair. 5 women in one location, disposed of over nearly 2 decades. Hendricks had been visiting that site regularly, reading poetry to multiple corpses, maintaining his twisted shrine while teaching English to unsuspecting students. "He lied," Maria said. "He said there were only 4. He's been playing us from the beginning." "Or he's forgotten," Robert suggested. It's been decades. Maybe Amanda and Colleen stopped mine shaft there, abandoned since the 1950s. I had discovered it years ago when I was hiking, trying to process my grief over Catherine. It's deep, maybe 100 feet, remote. No one goes there anymore. He paused. I knew the other 3 would never be found either. I chose that place specifically because it felt sacred somehow. A place where the past is preserved, untouched by the present. Maria forced herself to breathe steadily, to maintain professional composure even as rage burned through her veins. And the car? I drove it back to downtown, parked it in that garage, wiped it clean, walked to the light rail station and took it back to my car which I had left near her apartment. I went home, showered, and the next day I taught my classes as usual. 19 students learning about tragic heroes in Greek literature. The irony wasn't lost on me.
"You're not a tragic hero," Maria said coldly. "You're a serial killer who hid behind a respectable profession for decades." "I'm a man who loved literature too much," Hendricks replied, "who wanted to preserve beauty in an ugly world. Can't you see the poetry in that?" "There's no poetry in murder," Maria snapped, standing. "There's only suffering, the suffering of the women you killed, and the suffering of everyone who loved them." She left the interrogation room and found Robert in the observation area, watching through the one-way glass. His face was pale, and he was gripping the edge of the console so hard his knuckles had gone white. "I've never heard anything like that," Robert said. "The complete disconnect from reality. He genuinely believes he was doing something noble." "That's what makes him so dangerous," Maria replied. "He rationalized evil as love, murder as preservation, and he did it 4 times that we know of." "4 times that he's confessed to," Robert corrected. "I've been running deeper searches while you were in there, looking at every location where he's lived or taught, cross-referencing with unsolved missing persons cases. Maria, there might be more, many more." Maria felt the weight of that possibility settle on her shoulders. How many? At least 6 additional cases that match the pattern. Young women, former students, disappeared within a 100-mile radius of wherever he was living at the time, going all the way back to 1994, 2 years after he started teaching. "Jesus Christ," Maria breathed. 10 women? Maybe. We need to confirm. But if the pattern holds... Robert pulled up a map on the computer screen, showing dots representing missing persons cases and dots representing Hendricks's teaching assignments. The overlap was undeniable. He's been doing this for 30 years, and nobody noticed because he moved around. Different cities, different school districts, no one connected the dots. Maria stared at the map, at the geography of devastation. "We need to contact the families of these other women, and we need to search that mine shaft today." The search of the abandoned mine shaft took place 3 days later, after careful coordination with county authorities and a specialized recovery team. Dorothy Walker insisted on being there, standing at the edge of the cordoned-off area with Patricia Martinez, whose daughter Jennifer had disappeared in 1998. The 2 women held hands as the recovery team descended into the darkness with lights and cameras and specialized equipment. It was 112 degrees in the desert, heat radiating off the rocks in visible waves, but Dorothy barely noticed. She'd been cold since the moment she learned about Abigail's death. A coldness that seemed to start in her bones and radiate outward, no matter how hot the day. "I keep thinking about what he said," Patricia murmured, "about preserving them, as if our daughters were objects to be collected and stored." "He stole their futures," Dorothy replied hard. "Every child they would have taught, every person they would have loved, every moment of joy they would have experienced. He stole all of it because he couldn't handle his own grief." A 3rd woman approached, Rebecca Lawson's mother, Helen, who'd driven from Scottsdale. She was 63, wearing sunglasses despite the shaded area where they stood, and her hands shook as she introduced herself. "I always knew. From the moment Rebecca didn't come home, I knew she was gone. But knowing and confirming are different things." The women stood together,
an unwilling sorority bound by loss, and waited. It took 6 hours before the recovery team emerged. Maria Castellanos walked toward the families, her face grave, and Dorothy knew before she spoke that they'd found something. "We've recovered multiple sets of remains. We won't have positive identifications for several days, but based on what we found, clothing, personal items, we believe at least 4 individuals are down there." Dorothy's knees buckled and Patricia caught her. "4?" Dorothy whispered. "Only 4? He confessed to killing 4 women. What about the others Robert mentioned?" Maria's expression became even grimmer. "We're expanding the search. Hendricks has been talking more, claiming there are other locations, other sacred places, as he calls them. We've identified 3 more sites based on his descriptions. Teams are being assembled." "How many?" asked Helen, her voice breaking. "How many women did he kill?" "We don't know yet," Maria admitted again. "His confession keeps evolving. Every day he remembers more or decides to share more. He's treating this like—" She stopped, clearly struggling to find words. "Like a story," Dorothy finished bitterly. "He's treating this like one of his literature lessons, revealing the plot piece by piece to keep us engaged." "I'm sorry," Maria said, and the helplessness in her voice was genuine. "I'm sorry that this is what we found. I'm sorry that the truth is worse than we imagined." Over the following weeks, as recovery efforts continued across multiple sites in the Arizona desert, the true scope of Thomas Hendricks's crimes began to emerge. He'd killed not 4 women, but 9, spanning from 1994 to 2016. 9 young women who'd trusted him as a teacher, who'd been kind and empathetic and full of potential. 9 futures erased, because one man couldn't process his grief in healthy ways.
The media descended on Phoenix like locusts. Every news outlet wanted the story, the respected teacher who'd hidden a monster beneath his mild-mannered exterior. Reporters camped outside Dorothy Walker's house, outside the homes of the other victims' families, outside Desert Vista High School, where former students struggled to reconcile the teacher they'd known with the killer he'd been. One of those former students was a woman named Rachel Torres, now 32, who'd been in Hendricks' English class in 2010. She called Maria Castellanos after seeing the news coverage, her voice shaking. "I need to tell you something," Rachel said. "Something that's been bothering me for years, but I convinced myself it was nothing." Maria met Rachel at a coffee shop in Tempe, away from the media circus. Rachel was a social worker now, married with 2 children, but her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "Senior year," Rachel began, "I stayed after class one day to discuss my college essays. Mr. Hendricks offered to help, said he saw special potential in me. He was always very encouraging, very supportive. But that day, he asked me personal questions about my dating life, my plans for the future, whether I had siblings. When I mentioned I was an only child, his whole demeanor changed. He became very intense, very focused on me." "Did he touch you?" Maria asked carefully. "No, nothing physical, but he said something that stuck with me. He said, 'You remind me of someone precious. I need to make sure nothing bad happens to you. Promise me you'll be careful about who you trust.'" Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "At the time, I thought he was being paternal, concerned. But looking back, knowing what he did, I think he was selecting me, considering me for his collection." "What stopped him?" Maria asked. "I don't know. Maybe because I was graduating and leaving the state for college. Maybe because I didn't fit his pattern perfectly. I had dark hair, not blonde. Or maybe," Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper, "maybe he had already chosen Abigail Walker by then and was just window shopping." Maria felt sick. The calculated nature of Hendricks' crimes, the way he'd observed and selected and stalked, it suggested a level of premeditation that made the legal case stronger, but made the moral dimensions even more horrifying. "There's something else," Rachel continued.
After I saw the news, I contacted some other former students through social media, other women who'd been in his classes over the years. At least a dozen have similar stories, being singled out for extra attention, personal questions, offers to help with various things. He was grooming them, testing them, seeing who would be most vulnerable to his manipulation. Would these women be willing to testify? Yes, Rachel said firmly. We're angry, we're horrified, and we're guilty. We keep thinking, should we have said something? Should we have recognized the warning signs? This isn't your fault, Maria said firmly. Hendricks was a master manipulator. He knew how to present himself as caring and concerned. That's how predators work. They hide behind social acceptability. But we were trained, Rachel protested, as social workers, as teachers. Some of us work with vulnerable populations now. We're supposed to recognize warning signs, and we missed them in our own teacher. Maria reached across the table and gripped Rachel's hand. You were children, teenagers. You trusted an authority figure the way you were taught to trust. The failure isn't yours, it's the system's. It's the school districts that moved him from place to place without investigating complaints. It's the background check systems that didn't flag his pattern of behavior. The guilt belongs to Thomas Hendricks and only to him. But Rachel's question haunted Maria. Who else had missed the warning signs? As Maria dug deeper into Hendricks' employment history, a disturbing pattern emerged. At 3 different schools, female colleagues had filed informal complaints about his behavior, standing too close to young female students, asking inappropriate personal questions, showing up at school events where he hadn't been assigned. But each time, the complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. Each time, Hendricks had been counseled privately and allowed to continue teaching. At one school, when a parent complained that Hendricks had called their daughter at home to check on her progress, the principal had defended him as dedicated and going above and beyond. That daughter, Marie Stevenson, was now on Maria's list of potential victims. She disappeared in 2006, aged 23, after moving back to Phoenix following college graduation. Maria sat in Captain Morrison's office, presenting her findings. The system failed these women repeatedly, she said, spreading out documentation across his desk. Multiple red flags, multiple complaints, and nobody connected the dots because he moved schools every few years and the complaints never became official investigations. Captain Morrison, a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd been with Phoenix PD for 30 years, looked at the documents with growing horror. Why didn't anyone flag the pattern? Because each school only saw isolated incidents, and because he was good at his job otherwise, his students' test scores were high, his classroom management was solid, parents liked him. The complaints seemed minor compared to his overall record. Jesus, Morrison muttered. How do we prevent this from happening again? That's not my job to solve, Maria said bluntly. My job is to get justice for 9 dead women and their families. But someone needs to be looking at systemic changes, better background checks, centralized reporting of complaints across districts, mandatory training on recognizing predatory behavior.
Agreed, Morrison said. I'll reach out to the district attorney's office. They'll want to be involved in policy recommendations. He looked at Maria carefully. How are you holding up? This case is... I'm fine, Maria interrupted, knowing she was lying. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since Hendricks's arrest. She dreamed about the 9 women, about all the warning signs that had been missed, about how different things might have been if someone had listened to those early complaints. She thought about Dorothy Walker and Patricia Martinez and Helen Lawson and all the other mothers who'd spent years not knowing what happened to their daughters. She thought about the children those daughters would have taught, the lives they would have touched, the future generations that would never benefit from their presence. And she thought about Thomas Hendricks, sitting in his cell, still speaking in measured tones about literature and beauty and preservation, still unable or unwilling to grasp the magnitude of what he'd done.
I'm fine, Maria repeated, gathering her documents. I just want to make sure the case is airtight, that he never has a chance to walk free. He won't, Morrison assured her. 9 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence is overwhelming. Between the physical evidence, his confession, and the testimony we're gathering, no jury would acquit. But Maria knew that legal justice and actual justice were different things. Thomas Hendricks would spend the rest of his life in prison, yes, but that wouldn't bring back 9 murdered.
A pivotal thread involves Maya, a woman Abigail had taught to read as a child using Where the Wild Things Are. Inspired by Abigail's memory, Maya pursued teaching and became a powerful symbol of legacy transcending tragedy. Desert Vista High School, where Hendricks taught, renamed their English wing the Abigail Walker Hall of Literature and created a memorial wall honoring all 9 victims as they were in life, not death. The foundation's impact expanded rapidly. Within months, they established scholarship programs for aspiring teachers and social workers, created peer safety committees in schools, and began training sessions on recognizing predatory behavior. The annual 9 Voices Memorial 5K raised funds while building community solidarity. Former students who'd felt uncomfortable with Hendricks but been dismissed by administrators found validation and healing through the foundation's work. Detective Maria Castellanos, who'd worked Abigail's case for 13 years before finally solving it, grappled with guilt over the women she couldn't save. She maintained contact with Dorothy, witnessing the transformation of grief into protective action. The documentary evidence against Hendricks was overwhelming, but Maria recognized that true justice extended beyond conviction. It required systemic change to prevent future tragedies. 5 years after the arrest, news emerged of a San Diego teacher arrested before committing assault, thanks to foundation training helping students recognize warning signs. This represented the 10th such intervention that year, demonstrating the program's measurable impact. The foundation expanded to 8 states, training over 50,000 teachers and awarding more than 200 scholarships. Maya's career flourished. She became principal of Maryvale Elementary School, then eventually district superintendent. She maintained weekly contact with Dorothy until Dorothy's death at 88 in 2039. Throughout her career, Maya created reading spaces honoring Abigail and told her students about the teacher who'd inspired her, perpetuating a chain of educational dedication. The narrative traces this legacy across decades. Isabella, a student Maya taught, became a teacher herself, reading Where the Wild Things Are to her own students while sharing Abigail's story. By 2044, teachers across 35 states began days by acknowledging they were part of something larger, a chain of educators committed to protecting children and honoring 9 women whose deaths had sparked lasting change. Hendricks died in prison in 2043, after 19 years, meriting only a brief obituary. In contrast, the women he murdered lived on through scholarships, training programs, policy reforms, and thousands of educators inspired by their stories. The foundation influenced national education policy and trained over 250,000 teachers. Students learned to recognize grooming behaviors and assert boundaries. School districts implemented centralized complaint systems and mandatory safety protocols. The story explores how legacy operates differently than tragedy. Tragedy subtracts, ending lives, severing relationships, stealing futures. Legacy multiplies. One person's belief inspiring others who inspire thousands more, radiating across generations in immeasurable patterns. Maya understood this mathematics at Dorothy's grave on the 25th anniversary of Abigail's murder, surrounded by former students now beginning their own teaching careers. Throughout the narrative runs the question of what justice means when the worst has already happened. The families concluded that justice wasn't solely about punishment or closure, but transformation, refusing to let tragedy define them or have the final word. It meant families supporting each other, young people choosing teaching despite learning the profession's potential for both good and evil, and administrators protecting vulnerable students while honoring the dead. The story emphasizes that healing doesn't mean forgetting or minimizing loss. Dorothy never stopped grieving Abigail, never stopped acknowledging the infinite things her daughter would never experience. But she chose to build something meaningful on that foundation of loss, creating protective systems so other families might be spared similar devastation. 5 years into his sentence, Hendricks wrote Dorothy claiming remorse and therapeutic insight into his narcissism. She burned the letter, recognizing that his feelings were irrelevant. He'd already taken enough from her life without deserving more attention. This act symbolized her refusal to give him power over her continuing story. The narrative concludes with hope grounded in concrete action rather than empty optimism. Children across America opened books and discovered new worlds. Teachers read with passion and care. Administrators protected vulnerable students. And 9 women's dreams continued unfolding through lives they'd inspired, changes they'd sparked, and futures they'd made possible even in absence. The chain continued because some legacies proved too powerful to end, some stories too important to forget. The deeper dimensions of this story reveal how trauma ripples through communities and how intentional action can redirect those ripples toward healing. The Maryvale Community Center became a living memorial, its walls transformed into galleries of children's artwork depicting books and dreams. Rosa Hernandez, the center director, witnessed firsthand how Abigail's brief volunteer work generated decades of impact. When Daniel, a former struggling reader with dyslexia, returned as a credentialed teacher specializing in learning differences, he embodied the multiplication effect. One volunteer's patience creating a professional educator who would help hundreds more children. The Foundation's work extended beyond policy advocacy into cultural transformation. Schools that once dismissed student concerns about uncomfortable teacher behavior implemented peer safety committees where students received training to recognize grooming patterns and direct reporting channels bypassing potentially complicit adults. Jasmine, a Desert Vista student whose sister had felt uncomfortable in Hendricks's class but been called dramatic when requesting a transfer, channeled her siblings' guilt into activism. This illustrated how Hendricks's crimes traumatized far more than his direct victims. Countless students questioned their judgment and carried unearned responsibility for not stopping him. The legal and institutional response evolved substantially. The 9 Voices Education Safety Act mandated centralized complaint reporting, ending the practice of predatory teachers quietly moving between districts with clean records. Independent reviews became required for educators changing schools multiple times within 5 years. These reforms, cited as precedent in 17 states by the second anniversary of Hendricks's conviction, represented concrete barriers against future predators. Teachers' unions, initially resistant to increased scrutiny, adopted new safety protocols, recognizing that protecting their profession meant protecting students first. Media coverage shifted over time from sensationalism, the teacher who killed for literature, and Phoenix's most educated serial killer, toward more substantive examination of systemic failures and prevention strategies. The 2039 documentary 9 Voices, A Legacy of Hope, reframed the narrative entirely, centering the victim's aspirations and the Foundation's achievements rather than Hendricks's pathology. This represented a cultural maturation in how society processes serial violence, moving from morbid fascination with killers toward honoring victims and preventing future crimes. Dr. Rebecca Simmons' forensic testimony during the trial provided crucial psychological context. Her explanation that Hendricks viewed people as characters in his self-authored narrative, lacking genuine empathy while expertly simulating it, helped jurors understand how someone could teach compassionately while simultaneously grooming victims. His narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies meant he experienced no moral conflict. In his distorted perception, murder was artistic creation, preserving beauty rather than destroying life. This clinical framework helped families comprehend the incomprehensible without excusing it.
The trial testimony from survivors like Rachel Torres proved devastating in ways physical evidence couldn't. When she explained how Hendricks asked about her legacy and warned against wasted potential, painting himself as motivational while actually testing her vulnerability, she revealed the insidious mechanics of long-term grooming. 11 other women described identical patterns, being singled out, made to feel simultaneously special and inadequate, subjected to boundary pushing that seemed caring until recontextualized by his arrest. This pattern evidence demonstrated premeditation and calculation, destroying any defense claim of tragic misunderstanding. Hendricks's decision to testify against his attorney's advice provided a chilling window into his psychology. His claim of pure intentions and assertion that he preserved potential by preventing life's inevitable degradation revealed profound detachment from reality. When prosecutor Diane Ostroff forced him to name each victim and describe their murders, his disturbing calm while recounting Jennifer Martinez's begging and Rebecca Lawson's resistance horrified everyone present. This testimony ensured the jury saw him not as a sympathetic figure driven mad by his daughter's death, but as a calculating killer who weaponized grief to justify atrocity. The scholarship program emerged as particularly meaningful. By funding over 200 students pursuing education and social work careers, the very fields where victims had been headed, the foundation ensured their aspirations materialized through others.
Scholarship recipient represented a dream deferred, but not destroyed, redirected through different hands toward the same noble purposes. Recipients understood they carried forward specific legacies, their educations funded by women they'd never met, but whose values they inherited. Maya's trajectory from struggling 6-year-old reader to district superintendent illustrated legacy's exponential power. Abigail spent perhaps a few hours teaching her over several weeks at the community center. That investment generated a career educator who taught hundreds of children, mentored dozens of teachers, and eventually shaped district-wide policy affecting thousands of students. When Maya's former student Isabella became a teacher and told her own students about Abigail, the chain extended to a third generation. Each link multiplied impact geometrically. Dorothy's physical and emotional journey tracked the story's arc. Initially consumed by desperate hope during 13 years of uncertainty, then shattered by confirmation of Abigail's murder, she might have remained frozen in grief. Instead, alongside Patricia and Helen, she transformed devastation into determined advocacy. Their weekly meetings provided mutual support while planning foundation initiatives. By her death at 88, Dorothy had lived 36 years beyond Abigail's 23, spending the final 18 ensuring her daughter's legacy transcended victimhood. Her decision to burn Hendricks's apology letter symbolized refusing to grant him further power over her narrative. The narrative interrogates what justice means when conventional closure proves impossible. No verdict resurrects the dead. No sentence erases years of uncertainty and grief. The families recognized this limitation and created alternative justice through prevention. If they couldn't reclaim their daughters, they could protect other daughters. This proactive approach to justice prioritized future safety over past punishment, though both mattered. When news emerged of teachers stopped before harming students thanks to foundation training, it represented justice's most profound form. Tragedies that never occurred, families spared devastation. Marcus Reed's testimony during the Hall of Literature opening revealed bystander trauma. He'd observed Hendricks singling out female students, but dismissed concerns, not wanting to believe his favorite teacher was dangerous. Dorothy's gracious response, assigning responsibility to systemic failures rather than individual students, modeled how healing communities must reject blame culture while demanding institutional accountability. Young people cannot shoulder adult responsibilities. The system must protect them, not expect them to recognize sophisticated predators. The reading spaces created in Abigail's name, from school corners to community center rooms, provided tangible locations where her philosophy lived daily.
children sprawling on beanbags with books, discovering that stories were magic, directly fulfilled her belief that every child deserved a story. These spaces weren't mausoleums, but living classrooms where her work continued through other hands. When Isabella read to 11-year-olds in the Abigail Walker Reading Corner, the circle completed itself, from Abigail to Maya to Isabella to the next generation, each receiving and transmitting the gift of literacy. The narrative's conclusion at Dorothy's grave 25 years after Abigail's murder, surrounded by Maya's former students about to begin teaching careers, crystallized the story's central truth. Evil's lifespan is finite, but goodness compounds across generations. Hendricks got 19 years before prison death and a single-day obituary. The women he murdered got eternal legacies through scholarships, policies, trained educators, and protected children. The mathematics favored light over darkness because dedicated people refused to let tragedy write the ending. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.